When they forced Maya Sinclair to strip in front of 200 elite trainees, they expected to see weakness, shame, maybe even tears. What they didn't expect was the intricate presidential service tattoo running down her spine, a mark that made Master Chief Alexander Kane's blood run cold and changed everything in an instant. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Maya Sinclair stepped off the transport bus at Naval Special Warfare Training Center in Little Creek, Virginia, carrying nothing but a worn duffel bag and paperwork that raised more questions than it answered. At 31, she looked more like a librarian than someone applying for the most grueling military training program in the world. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her civilian clothes, a plain gray sweater and dark jeans, seemed almost deliberately unremarkable. No makeup, no jewelry, nothing that would draw attention or suggest she belonged in a place where only the most elite operators were forged. The other candidates had been arriving all morning, and the contrast was stark. These were men and women who looked like they'd stepped out of a recruitment poster, broad shoulders, confident strides, uniforms pressed to perfection. They moved with the swagger of people who'd spent years proving themselves in conventional military units, each one carrying recommendations from commanding officers who'd staked their reputations on their candidates. Potential. Maya walked through the registration process with quiet efficiency, her movements economical and precise, but lacking the aggressive confidence that seemed to radiate from everyone else. When she handed her paperwork to the processing clerk, the young sailor's eyebrows shot up as he scanned the documents. The forms were legitimate, bearing all the right stamps and signatures, but they were unlike anything he'd seen before. Where other candidates had detailed service records and performance evaluations, Maya's file contained mostly redacted sections and references to programs he'd never heard of. "Ma'am," the clerk said hesitantly, "there seems to be some information missing from the documentation is complete." Maya interrupted softly, her voice carrying an odd weight despite its quiet tone. "If there are questions about my eligibility, they should be directed to the program administrator." The clerk nodded uncertainly and processed her through, assigning her a bunk in the candidate barracks and handing her the standard issue training gear. As Maya walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about her file, something that went beyond the unusual paperwork. There was a note attached to her folder that he'd been instructed not to discuss, a simple directive that her background was classified at levels that required clearance he didn't possess. Maya's assigned bunk was in a bay with 7 other female candidates, each one representing the cream of their respective military branches. As she unpacked her few belongings, she could feel their eyes on her, assessing, judging, finding her lacking. The woman in the bunk next to hers, Staff Sergeant Victoria Blake, had arms like tree trunks and a chest full of ribbons that told the story of someone who'd earned respect through blood and determination. Blake was 26, a Marine who'd served 3 combat tours and had a reputation for breaking male recruits who thought they could keep up with her. "So," Blake said, her voice carrying the authority of someone used to being the alpha in any room, "what's your story, sweetheart? Which general's daughter are you?" Maya continued folding her clothes with the same methodical precision she'd shown at registration. "I'm here to complete the program, same as everyone else." Blake laughed, a sound without humor. "Right, and I'm here for the vacation." She gestured at Maya's civilian clothes. "You do realize this isn't summer camp, right? This is the most demanding military training program in the world. People wash out in the first week because they can't handle the physical requirements, and you look like you'd have trouble opening a pickle jar." The other women in the bay were listening now, some openly, others pretending to focus on their own preparations while hanging on every word. Maya's response would set the tone for how she'd be treated for the duration of the program, if she lasted that long. "I appreciate your concern," Maya said, her tone remaining neutral, almost conversational. "I'm sure your experience will be valuable during training." It wasn't exactly a comeback, but it wasn't submission either. Blake seemed unsure how to respond to Maya's calm deflection. Most people either cowered under Blake's intimidation or rose to meet her aggression. Maya had done neither, creating an awkward moment that left the Marine sergeant feeling off balance. Private First Class Tiffany Lewis, a 23-year-old Army Ranger with blonde hair and the kind of muscular build that came from years of serious training, decided to fill the silence. "No offense," she said, though her tone suggested offense was exactly what she intended. "But what unit did you serve with? I mean, to get into this program, you need some serious credentials." Maya closed her duffel bag and sat on the edge of her bunk. "I've served in various capacities. The specifics aren't something I'm authorized to discuss." The answer was professional, appropriate, and completely unsatisfying. It was also exactly the kind of response that would fuel speculation and resentment among people who'd earned their spots through conventional channels. Lewis exchanged glances with Blake, and both women wore expressions that suggested they'd already made up their minds about their new bunkmate. Corporal Derek Mason, a Navy EOD specialist who'd been eavesdropping from the mail bay next door, decided to join the conversation. At 28, Mason had the kind of lean build and steady hands that came from years of diffusing explosives, and the confidence that came from surviving work where mistakes were measured in body parts. "You know what I think?" he said, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed. "I think someone pulled some serious strings to get you here. This program is for operators, not office workers looking for adventure stories to tell at dinner parties." Maya's eyes moved to Mason, and for just a moment, something flickered in her gaze, not anger, not hurt, but a kind of clinical assessment, as if she were cataloging information for future reference. "I understand your skepticism," she said. "Time will tell whether I belong here or not." The dismissal was polite, but final. Maya stood and began making her bunk with military precision, her movements efficient and practiced despite her civilian appearance. The corners were perfect, the blanket tight enough to bounce a quarter, the pillow positioned exactly where regulations required. It was clear she'd done this before, though none of them could figure out where or when. As evening approached, and the candidates gathered for their first briefing, Maya found herself isolated in a sea of suspicious faces. She'd chosen a seat near the back, her notebook ready, her posture alert but unremarkable. Around her, conversations flowed about previous assignments, shared acquaintances, war stories that established pecking orders and social hierarchies. Maya participated in none of it, content to observe and take notes in handwriting that was too small for anyone else to read. The briefing itself was standard expectations. Standards, consequences of failure. What wasn't standard was the way Maya absorbed the information, her pen moving steadily across pages that she kept angled away from curious eyes. While others asked questions about procedures and protocols, Maya remained silent, but her attention never wavered. She was listening to everything, processing information on levels that went beyond the obvious. When the briefing ended and candidates began filtering back to their quarters, Maya was one of the last to leave. As she walked across the compound in the gathering darkness, she could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes on her back. Tomorrow, the real training would begin, and everyone was curious to see how long the quiet woman with the mysterious background would last. What none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was that Maya Sinclair had already survived training that made this program look like basic conditioning. The scars hidden beneath her unremarkable clothes told stories of operations that existed only in classified files, of missions where failure meant more than just washing out of a program. She'd earned credentials that couldn't be displayed on a uniform, gained experience that couldn't be discussed in mixed company, and learned lessons that came with a price most people couldn't imagine paying. But for now, she was just another candidate, another face in the crowd of hopefuls who thought they had what it took to join the ranks of the elite. The judgment, the skepticism, the casual dismissal, she'd faced all of it before, in places where the stakes were life and death rather than professional embarrassment. Maya Sinclair had learned long ago that the most dangerous operators were often the ones nobody saw coming. As she prepared for lights out in a bay full of women who'd already written her off as a pretender, she allowed herself a small smile. They had no idea what they were dealing with, and by the time they figured it out, it would be far too late to adjust their assumptions. The real show was about to begin. The alarm shattered the pre-dawn silence at 0500 hours, and Maya was already awake. While her bunkmates groaned and stumbled toward their gear, she moved with quiet efficiency, dressing in the standard PT uniform that hung loose on her slight frame. The other women noticed her readiness but interpreted it as nervous anticipation rather than professional habit. They had no way of knowing that Maya had been conditioning herself to wake before any alarm for over a decade, that her body clock had been reset by missions where oversleeping meant death. Staff Sergeant Victoria Blake emerged from her bunk like a force of nature, her muscular frame filling out the PT gear in a way that advertised serious physical conditioning. She glanced at Maya with undisguised skepticism, taking in the way the uniform seemed to swallow the smaller woman's frame. "Hope you've been hitting the gym, Princess," Blake muttered, loud enough for the entire bay to hear. "Because today's going to separate the players from the pretenders." The first physical training session was designed to establish baseline fitness levels, and it was brutal by any reasonable standard. 2-mile run in full gear, followed by an obstacle course that tested strength, agility, and mental toughness. Maya fell into formation with the other candidates, her expression neutral, her breathing controlled. She didn't look nervous, which surprised some observers, but she also didn't look particularly confident, which confirmed the assumptions of others. When the run began, Maya settled into a pace that was steady but unremarkable. She wasn't struggling, but she wasn't dominating either. She maintained position in the middle of the pack, her stride efficient and economical, her breathing even despite the weight of the gear. Private First Class Tiffany Lewis, running just ahead of her, kept glancing back with a mixture of surprise and suspicion. Maya should have been falling behind, should have been gasping for air, should have been showing some sign that this was beyond her capabilities. "She's probably been training for months just to get ready for this," Lewis panted to Corporal Derek Mason, who was keeping pace beside her. "Probably hired a personal trainer and everything." Mason nodded, though he was breathing too hard to respond. The truth was, Maya looked like she could have been out for a casual morning jog. Her form was textbook perfect, her pace never varied, and she showed no signs of distress despite carrying the same gear load as everyone else. It was annoying, frankly, because it suggested she might actually belong here, which didn't fit with their assessment of her as an unqualified interloper. Obstacle course was where Maya's true capabilities began to show, though in ways that raised more questions than they answered. She approached each obstacle with careful analysis, studying the technique of others before making her own attempt. When she moved, it was with precision rather than power, using leverage and timing instead of brute force. She wasn't the fastest through the course, but she was among the most efficient, completing each challenge with a minimum of wasted motion. Blake watched Maya navigate a rope climb with growing irritation. The smaller woman ascended using a technique that maximized the use of her legs, while minimizing the strain on her arms, a method that suggested formal training rather than natural athleticism. "Show off," Blake muttered, though privately she had to admit the technique was sound. What really bothered the other candidates was Maya's note-taking. During breaks, while others caught their breath or complained about the difficulty, Maya would pull out her small notebook and write. Not casual observations or personal thoughts, but detailed technical notes that she kept angled away from curious eyes. Her handwriting was cramped and quick, filled with abbreviations and symbols that looked more like tactical notations than training diary entries. "What the hell is she writing?" Lewis asked Blake during a water break. "It's like she's conducting some kind of scientific study." Blake had been wondering the same thing. Maya's behavior was unlike any trainee she'd ever encountered. Most people were either struggling to keep up or showing off their superior conditioning. Maya was doing neither. She was documenting everything with the detached professionalism of someone conducting an assessment rather than participating in training. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, the primary instructor for their group, had also noticed Maya's unusual approach. Cross was 34, a former Army Ranger with multiple combat deployments and a reputation for identifying weaknesses before they became problems. He'd been watching Maya carefully, looking for signs of the inevitable breakdown that came when civilian overconfidence met military reality. Instead, he was seeing something that didn't fit any category he recognized. During the afternoon's tactical movement exercise, Maya's true background began to show in ways that were impossible to ignore. The exercise involved moving through a wooded area while avoiding detection by instructors, playing the role of enemy observers. Most candidates approached it like an advanced game of hide-and-seek, using obvious cover and moving in patterns that were predictable to anyone with real combat experience. Maya moved differently. She used terrain features that others overlooked, chose routes that minimized exposure time, and demonstrated an understanding of sight lines and detection angles that went far beyond anything taught in basic training. When she reached the objective, a flag that candidates were supposed to retrieve without being spotted, she had been completely undetected by the instructor teams. Cross was waiting at the finish point when Maya emerged from the woodline, and his expression was troubled rather than congratulatory. "Where did you learn to move like that?" he asked without preamble. Maya's response was the same polite deflection she'd been using since arrival. "Various training courses, sir. Nothing that isn't available through standard military education." It was technically true but completely misleading, and Cross knew it. The movement techniques Maya had displayed were taught in specialized schools that most soldiers never even heard of, much less attended. Her route selection showed an understanding of advanced reconnaissance principles that came from real-world application rather than classroom instruction. That evening, as candidates gathered for chow, the speculation about Maya reached new levels of intensity. She had performed well enough to silence claims that she didn't belong physically, but her competence only deepened the mystery of her background. Blake, Lewis, and Mason huddled together at one end of the mess hall, their voices low but their glances frequent and obvious. "There's something seriously off about her," Blake said, picking at her meal without appetite. "Nobody moves like that without serious training. And if she had serious training, why isn't it in her record?" Lewis nodded vigorously. "And did you see how she handled the rope climb? That's not something you learn at a civilian gym. That's military technique, advanced military technique." Mason, who had been the most vocal in his criticism of Maya's presence, found himself in the uncomfortable position of having to admit she might be legitimate. "Maybe she's some kind of special operations washout," he suggested. "Someone who got kicked out for psychological reasons or disciplinary problems." The theory gained traction because it explained Maya's competence while maintaining their narrative that she didn't truly belong. It allowed them to acknowledge her skills while still considering her fundamentally flawed, unworthy of the elite program they were all struggling to complete. Maya, sitting alone at a corner table, was aware of their speculation but unconcerned by it. She'd faced suspicious colleagues before, in situations where the stakes were considerably higher than professional reputation. Her notebook lay open beside her tray, filled with observations that would have surprised anyone who could read them. She wasn't just documenting the training, she was analyzing it, identifying inefficiencies and gaps that could Be improved. The exercises they'd completed that day were well designed for general fitness and basic tactical awareness, but they lacked the specificity needed for real-world operations. The obstacle course tested strength and agility, but didn't simulate the kind of equipment-heavy movements required in actual combat. The stealth exercise was good for teaching basic principles, but failed to account for the electronic surveillance and thermal imaging that modern enemies employed. Maya had completed similar training protocols in environments where failure meant capture, torture, or death. She'd learned to move through hostile territory where a single mistake could compromise missions that affected national security. The training here was challenging for its intended purpose, but it was also predictable, designed for candidates who would be operating within established military structures rather than in the gray areas where true special operations took place. As the evening wore on and candidates began preparing for the next day's challenges, Maya remained at her table, writing steadily in her notebook. Her isolation was no longer just a matter of social awkwardness. It was becoming a statement, a declaration that she operated by different rules and standards than the people around her. Tomorrow would bring new tests, new opportunities for her fellow candidates to find fault with her presence. But Maya had survived challenges that made military training look like preparation rather than actual work. The real question wasn't whether she could complete the program. It was whether she could maintain her cover long enough to accomplish whatever mission had brought her here in the first place. By the end of the first week, Staff Sergeant Victoria Blake had made Maya Sinclair her personal mission. What had started as casual dismissal had evolved into something more focused and deliberate, a campaign to expose what Blake was convinced was an elaborate fraud. Maya's continued competence in training exercises only fueled Blake's determination to prove that the quiet woman didn't belong among legitimate operators. Blake had built her reputation on her ability to identify weakness, to spot the candidates who would crack under pressure before they endangered real missions. In her mind, Maya represented everything wrong with modern military culture: connections trumping competence, politics overriding performance, civilians playing at being soldiers because someone had pulled the right strings. The fact that Maya hadn't failed yet only proved how sophisticated the deception was. "She's good, I'll give her that," Blake said to her growing circle of supporters during their morning coffee. "But there's a difference between being well prepared and being qualified. Anyone can train for a specific test if they know what's coming." Corporal Derek Mason nodded enthusiastically. Over the past week, he'd appointed himself as Blake's primary ally in what they'd started calling Operation Reality Check. Mason's expertise in explosive ordnance disposal had given him a particular appreciation for identifying things that didn't belong, and everything about Maya triggered his professional paranoia. "The way she takes those notes," Mason said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "She's documenting everything like she's planning to write a book or something. Real operators don't do that. Real operators live in the moment, adapt to changing situations. She's too analytical." Private First Class Tiffany Lewis had initially been less certain about Maya's illegitimacy, but Blake's certainty was infectious, and Lewis found herself drawn into the group dynamics of shared suspicion. "Maybe she's some kind of corporate spy," Lewis suggested. "Like trying to steal training methods for a private military company or something." The theory gained traction because it explained Maya's competence while maintaining her status as an outsider. If she was conducting industrial espionage, it would explain why she was so well prepared and why her documentation was so thorough. It also justified their growing hostility as patriotic duty rather than personal animosity. Blake decided it was time to move beyond speculation and into direct action. During the second week's hand-to-hand combat training, she volunteered to partner with Maya for demonstration purposes. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, still puzzled by Maya's background, but unable to identify any specific deficiencies in her performance, agreed to the pairing. "Let's see what you're really made of," Blake said as they faced each other on the training mat. She was 6 inches taller than Maya and outweighed her by at least 40 pounds, with arms that could probably bench press Maya's entire body weight. The other candidates gathered around, sensing that this was more than a routine training exercise. Maya approached the sparring session with the same methodical calm she brought to everything else. She studied Blake's stance, noted the slight favor toward her left side that suggested an old injury, observed the way Blake's weight distribution revealed her likely attack patterns. When Cross gave the signal to begin, Maya didn't rush forward or attempt to match Blake's aggressive energy. Instead, she waited. Blake launched herself forward with the confidence of someone who dominated every physical confrontation she'd ever been in, throwing a combination of punches that should have overwhelmed her smaller opponent. Maya slipped the first punch with minimal movement, redirected the second with a technique that used Blake's momentum against her, and countered with a strike that was precise rather than powerful. Blake found herself off balance, her confident assault turned into an awkward stumble that left her exposed and confused. Maya didn't press the advantage, she simply reset to her defensive position and waited for the next attack. The message was clear. Blake was fighting someone who understood combat at a level that went far beyond gymnasium sparring. "Lucky shot," Blake muttered, though privately she was shaken. She'd felt Maya's counterstrike land with surgical precision, targeting pressure points that most people didn't even know existed. The smaller woman's technique was too refined, too specialized for someone who'd learned fighting in conventional military training. The second exchange was even more humiliating. Blake attempted a grappling move that should have allowed her to use her size advantage, but Maya flowed around the attack like water, ending up behind Blake with a position that could have ended the fight instantly. Again, Maya didn't exploit the advantage, she simply disengaged and resumed her ready stance. Cross called an end to the demonstration, but the damage to Blake's ego was complete. She'd been outclassed by someone she'd dismissed as a pretender, and everyone had seen it happen. The humiliation was bad enough, but the professional implications were worse. If Maya was legitimate, if she really did possess the skills she'd just demonstrated, then Blake's entire assessment had been wrong from the beginning. That afternoon, Blake convened what amounted to a war council with Mason, Lewis, and several other candidates who'd grown suspicious of Maya's presence. They gathered in a maintenance shed away from instructor observation, their voices low but their emotions running high. "Did you see that?" Blake said, her face still flushed with embarrassment and anger. "Those weren't standard military techniques. That was some kind of specialized training, stuff they don't teach in regular units." Mason was nodding before Blake finished speaking. "Exactly. Which proves she's not what she claims to be. Nobody gets that kind of training without it being documented somewhere. The fact that her file is mostly redacted means someone's covering something up." Lewis, who had watched the sparring session with growing unease, voiced what they were all thinking. What if she's not here to train? What if she's here to evaluate us, to report back to someone about our performance? The suggestion sent a chill through the group. Military careers could be destroyed by negative evaluations, and the idea that Maya might be conducting some kind of covert assessment made their previous harassment seem potentially catastrophic. But Blake, rather than backing down, doubled down on her aggression. "Then we need to expose her before she can file whatever report she's planning," Blake said. "We need to force her into a situation where she has to reveal what she really is." The plan they developed was simple and cruel. During the next large group exercise, they would systematically isolate Maya, force her to fail, and document her breakdown for the instructors to see. If she was a legitimate candidate, the pressure would reveal her limitations. If she was something else, the stress would force her to drop her cover. Mason volunteered to coordinate with candidates from other training groups, expanding their network of suspicion and ensuring that Maya would face hostility from multiple directions. Lewis agreed to document everything, creating a record that could be used to justify their actions if questions were asked later. What none of them understood was that Maya had been monitoring their activities since the first day. Her notebook contained detailed psychological profiles of every candidate in the program, including assessments of who was most likely to become a problem and how they would probably act on their suspicions. Blake's group had been predictable. In their evolution from skepticism to open hostility, Maya had faced hostile colleagues before, in environments where the consequences of conflict went far beyond damaged careers. She'd learned to identify threats early and neutralize them before they could compromise mission objectives. The current situation was more complex because she couldn't simply eliminate the problem. She had to maintain her cover while dealing with increasing scrutiny from people who had nothing better to do than speculate about her background. As the second week drew to a close, Maya could sense the building pressure from Blake's coalition. Their whispered conversations stopped when she entered rooms. Their glances had become openly hostile, and their comments had shifted from casual mockery to pointed accusations. They were preparing for some kind of confrontation, and Maya knew she would have to be ready for whatever they planned. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd volunteered for this assignment specifically because her background made her uniquely qualified to assess and improve special operations training protocols. The president himself had signed the orders that brought her here, recognizing that someone with her experience could identify weaknesses that conventional evaluators might miss, but the same skills that made her valuable to national security made her suspicious to people who couldn't understand how someone could be so competent without fitting their expectations of what competence looked like. They were about to learn that their assumptions about strength, authority, and legitimacy were dangerously incomplete. The third week of training brought a new level of intensity that pushed every candidate to their breaking point. The instructors had weeded out the obviously unqualified, leaving behind 43 candidates who represented the cream of their respective military branches. The exercises became more complex, the standards more demanding, and the psychological pressure more severe. It was exactly the environment that Blake and her allies had been waiting for, a crucible where Maya's perceived weaknesses would finally be exposed. Maya continued her routine of quiet competence, but the hostility around her had become impossible to ignore. Conversation stopped when she entered the mess hall. Equipment mysteriously went missing from her gear locker. Her bunk was repeatedly tossed during random inspections that seemed to target only her belongings. The harassment was systematic and coordinated, designed to create stress and distraction that would degrade her performance. Lieutenant Nathan Cross noticed the change in group dynamics, but misinterpreted its significance. From his perspective, Maya was finally facing the kind of social pressure that separated true operators from individuals who might be technically competent but couldn't function as part of a team. Military effectiveness depended on cohesion, and someone who couldn't earn the respect of their peers was a liability, regardless of their individual capabilities. During the week's first major exercise, a 48-hour field problem that tested everything from navigation to combat skills, Blake's coalition put their plan into action. The exercise divided candidates into small teams for a series of overlapping missions, and Blake had used her influence to ensure that Maya was assigned to her squad along with Mason, Lewis, and 2 other candidates who'd been recruited to their cause. The mission seemed straightforward: navigate 15 miles through hostile territory, gather intelligence at 3 separate objectives, and extract to a designated pickup point within the time limit. What wasn't straightforward was the deliberate sabotage that began almost immediately after the team left the starting point. Maya had been designated as the team's navigator, a role that should have played to her demonstrated strengths in land navigation and tactical movement. But when she consulted the map and compass that had been issued to her, she discovered that the compass had been tampered with, its needle offset by several degrees, enough to cause significant navigation errors over long distances. Problem? Blake asked innocently when Maya paused to verify her initial bearing using alternate methods. Equipment malfunction, Maya replied calmly, producing a backup compass from her personal gear. She'd learned long ago to never depend on issued equipment for critical functions, a lesson that had saved her life on more than one occasion. Blake's expression tightened. The compass sabotage had been Mason's idea, designed to create a cascade of failures that would expose Maya as incompetent under pressure. The fact that Maya had prepared for equipment failure suggested a level of professionalism that complicated their narrative. The second attempt at sabotage came during the team's movement to the first objective. Lewis, responsible for rear security, began lagging behind at critical moments, creating gaps in the formation that violated basic tactical principles. When Maya called attention to the problem, Lewis responded with hostility that was unprofessional even by the relaxed standards of training exercises. Maybe if you weren't setting such an aggressive pace, the team could maintain proper formation, Lewis snapped, her voice carrying farther than tactical doctrine recommended. Maya stopped the team and conducted a brief after-action review, using the kind of measured professionalism that made Blake's jaw clench with frustration. She identified the formation problems, suggested solutions, and redistributed responsibilities without directly accusing anyone of deliberate misconduct. It was a masterclass in small unit leadership that impressed the other two team members. While making Blake's coalition look petty and unprofessional, the third and most serious sabotage attempt came at the first objective, where the team was supposed to conduct surveillance on an instructor playing the role of an enemy commander. The mission required careful coordination and strict noise discipline, but Mason chose that moment to accidentally discharge his training weapon, a blank round that sounded like a cannon shot in the quiet forest. The noise compromised the entire mission, alerting the enemy to their presence and forcing an immediate withdrawal. According to the exercise rules, the team would receive a failing grade for the objective, and 3 failed objectives meant elimination from the program. Maya's response surprised everyone, including her tormentors. Instead of expressing frustration or assigning blame, she calmly called for a team huddle and began developing an alternate plan. "The original approach is compromised," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But the exercise rules don't specify how we gather the required intelligence. We can adapt our method while maintaining the mission objective." What followed was a demonstration of tactical creativity that went far beyond anything taught in conventional military schools. Maya identified an alternate observation position that the exercise designers probably hadn't considered, developed a communication plan that used natural sounds to coordinate team movement, and created contingency plans for multiple failure scenarios. The modified plan worked flawlessly. The team gathered the required intelligence, documented enemy movements with precision that impressed the evaluating instructors, and extracted without further compromise. What should have been a devastating failure had been transformed into one of the most successful objective completions of the entire exercise. Blake was furious. Every attempt to expose Maya's weaknesses had instead highlighted her strengths, making Blake's team look incompetent by comparison. The deliberate equipment failures, the formation problems, the noise discipline violations, all of it had been overcome by Maya's professional competence and adaptability. "She's making us look like amateurs," Mason whispered during a brief rest. "Halt!" His face was flushed with embarrassment and anger, the result of having his sabotage attempt turned into a teaching moment about backup planning and redundant systems. Lewis was equally frustrated. "It's like she's been through this exact scenario before. No one adapts that quickly unless they know what's coming." The observation was more accurate than Lewis realized. Maya had indeed faced similar challenges before, in environments where improvisation meant the difference between mission success and national security disasters. She'd learned to treat equipment failures and personnel problems as normal conditions rather than Exceptional circumstances. But the most disturbing aspect of Maya's performance wasn't her technical competence. It was her apparent immunity to the psychological pressure that was breaking other candidates. She showed no signs of stress, no indication that the sustained harassment was affecting her decision-making abilities. If anything, she seemed to perform better under pressure, as if conflict and uncertainty were her natural element. Evening's planning session for the next day's objectives. Maya pulled out her ever-present notebook and began documenting the day's lessons learned. Her notes included tactical observations, equipment recommendations, and leadership insights that read like professional after-action reports rather than training diary entries. Blake watched Maya write with growing unease. The notebook had become a symbol of everything that was wrong with this situation, evidence that Maya was conducting some kind of evaluation rather than participating in training. The careful documentation, the clinical objectivity, the professional detachment, it all suggested someone who was studying the program rather than trying to complete it. "What exactly are you writing in there?" Blake asked, her voice carrying an edge that made the other team members look up from their own preparations. Maya glanced up from her notebook, her expression neutral but her eyes alert. "Training observations. Standard practice for continuous improvement." "Standard practice for who?" Blake pressed. "I've been through a dozen advanced training programs, and I've never seen anyone document exercises like that." The confrontation was building towards something that couldn't be walked back, and everyone in the team could feel it. Maya's calm professionalism was like sandpaper against Blake's growing frustration, creating friction that would eventually require resolution through force rather than reason. Maya closed her notebook and secured it in her gear. "Different units have different practices, Sergeant. I'm sure your experience has been valuable, but it may not be comprehensive." It was a polite way of saying that Blake's knowledge was limited, and everyone understood the implication. Blake's face darkened with anger, but before she could respond, the team's radio crackled with instructions for the next day's mission. The confrontation would have to wait, but it was clear that the pressure was building toward an explosion that would change everything for everyone involved. The morning of day 21 dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that made the Virginia humidity feel like a physical weight pressing down on everything. It was evaluation day, the culmination of 3 weeks of intensive training that would determine which candidates advanced to the final phase of the program. The remaining 38 candidates had survived everything the instructors could throw at them, but today's exercise would separate the truly elite from those who were merely competent. Lieutenant Nathan Cross stood before the assembled candidates, his expression grim with the kind of seriousness that preceded life-changing announcements. Behind him, a team of senior instructors and evaluators had gathered, including several faces that most candidates didn't recognize, officers whose presence suggested that today's assessment carried implications beyond simple program advancement. "Today's exercise will test everything you've learned," Cross announced, his voice carrying across the formation. "Individual skills, team coordination, decision-making under pressure, and leadership under fire. Those who demonstrate the qualities we're looking for will advance. Those who don't will be transferred to other programs more suited to their capabilities." Maya stood at attention in the formation, her expression neutral, but her mind analyzing the subtle details that others missed. The presence of the additional evaluators, the formal language Cross was using, the way certain candidates were being watched more closely than others, all of it suggested that today was about more than routine assessment. Cross continued his briefing, outlining an exercise that combined elements of everything they'd trained for over the past 3 weeks. Small teams would infiltrate a mock enemy compound, gather intelligence, rescue a simulated hostage, and extract under fire. Each team would be evaluated on their tactical proficiency, but individual candidates would also face personal challenges, designed to reveal their true capabilities under extreme stress. Team assignments have been posted, Cross concluded. You have 30 minutes to review the mission briefing and prepare your equipment. Questions? Maya checked the assignment roster and felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She'd been assigned to Team Alpha, led by Staff Sergeant Victoria Blake, with Corporal Derek Mason and Private First Class Tiffany Lewis as her teammates. It wasn't a coincidence. Someone had deliberately created a situation where her antagonist would have maximum opportunity to expose whatever they thought she was hiding. Blake's smile when she saw the team roster was sharp and predatory. She'd spent weeks planning for exactly this opportunity, and the exercise parameters would give her multiple chances to push Maya beyond her breaking point. The mission was complex enough that a single weak link could doom the entire team, providing perfect justification for whatever pressure tactics Blake chose to employ. Well, Welk said as the team gathered for mission planning. Looks like it's time to see what you're really made of, Maya. No more hiding behind other people's competence. Maya spread out the mission briefing materials with methodical precision, her movements calm despite the obvious hostility from her teammates. The target compound was a complex facility with multiple buildings, perimeter security, and roving patrols. The hostage was located in a central structure that could only be accessed after neutralizing several security checkpoints. Time limits were tight, failure conditions were numerous, and the evaluation criteria were deliberately vague. Standard infiltration approach, Mason suggested, though his tone made it clear he wasn't actually asking for Maya's input. Fast and aggressive, overwhelming force at the primary entrance. Maya studied the tactical map for a long moment before responding. The approach you're describing has a low probability of success given the defensive layout. The primary entrance is designed to channel attackers into a kill zone. We'd be eliminated before reaching the first checkpoint. Blake's expression hardened. So what's your brilliant alternative, Princess? Wait for them to surrender? Deception and misdirection, Maya replied, pointing to specific features on the map. Create a diversion at the primary entrance while the actual assault team approaches from this secondary position. Use the compound's own defensive measures against them. Lewis snorted derisively. That's the kind of complicated nonsense that gets people killed in real operations. Keep it simple, keep it direct. Maya's eyes flicked to Lewis with the kind of clinical assessment that made people uncomfortable. Simple and direct works when you have overwhelming superiority. When you don't, you need to be smarter than your opponent. The planning session deteriorated from there, with Blake's team systematically rejecting every suggestion Maya made while proposing increasingly reckless alternatives. It was clear that they cared more about undermining Maya than about successfully completing the mission, a priority that would have been professionally disastrous in any real operation. When the exercise began, Blake immediately implemented her aggressive frontal assault plan despite Maya's objections. The result was predictable. The team was killed by defensive fires before they'd advanced 50 meters into the compound. According to exercise rules, they now had to complete the mission with simulated casualties and reduced capabilities. Outstanding leadership, Sergeant, Maya said quietly as they regrouped for their second attempt. Her tone was neutral, but everyone heard the implied criticism. Blake's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. The mission was going exactly as badly as Maya had predicted, making Blake look incompetent in front of evaluators who were documenting every mistake. Maybe if certain team members were more supportive instead of undermining morale, we'd be performing better, she snapped. Morale isn't undermined by honest tactical assessment, Maya replied. It's undermined by pride getting in the way of mission accomplishment. The comment hit Blake like a physical blow because it was so obviously true. She'd allowed her personal animosity toward Maya to compromise her professional judgment, and everyone could see it happening. The evaluators were taking notes. Her team was losing confidence in her leadership, and Maya's calm competence was making her look increasingly desperate and unprofessional. That's when Blake made the decision that would change everything. If she couldn't prove Maya was incompetent through legitimate means, she would force the issue through methods that went beyond acceptable training protocols. The mission gave her authority over Maya's actions, and she intended to use that authority to create a situation where Maya would finally break. "New plan," Blake announced, her voice carrying a tone that brooked no argument. "Maya, you're taking point on the next assault. Solo penetration of the main compound while we provide overwatch." It was a suicide mission disguised as tactical. Assignment, requiring Maya to advance alone against multiple defensive positions, with no realistic hope of success. Even if she survived the approach, she'd be captured or killed within minutes of entering the compound. Blake was essentially ordering Maya to fail publicly and dramatically. Maya studied the compound layout one more time, her mind automatically calculating angles, timing, and probability curves that would have impressed professional military planners. What Blake didn't understand was that Maya had successfully completed similar missions under far worse conditions, against real enemies, using live ammunition instead of training simulations. "Understood," Maya said simply. "I'll need 5 minutes to plan the approach route." Blake expected protests, arguments, or at least some sign that Maya understood the impossibility of what she was being asked to do. Instead, Maya was treating the suicide mission like a routine tactical problem, analyzing it with the same professional detachment she brought to everything else. "No," Blake said, her voice sharp with frustration. "You don't get 5 minutes to plan. You don't get to consult your precious notebook. You go now with the equipment you have, using the skills you claim to possess." The other team members were looking uncomfortable now. Even Mason and Lewis could see that. Blake was crossing lines that had nothing to do with training evaluation and everything to do with personal vendetta. But Maya simply nodded acknowledgement and began checking her gear with routine efficiency. "Roger that," she said, initiating solo assault in 30 seconds. Blake watched Maya prepare for what should have been professional suicide and felt a growing sense of unease. Maya wasn't showing any signs of stress or fear. If anything, she looked more focused and purposeful than she had during any previous exercise. It was the expression of someone who was finally being asked to do something that matched their actual capabilities. The evaluators had moved closer to observe, their attention focused entirely on what was about to happen. Cross was speaking quietly into his radio, coordinating with other instructor teams who were monitoring the exercise. Everyone sensed that they were about to witness something significant, though none of them understood exactly what that might be. Maya finished her equipment check and looked back at Blake one final time. "Any specific intelligence requirements, or just successful hostage recovery?" "Just don't get yourself killed," Blake replied, though her tone suggested she wouldn't be particularly upset if Maya failed spectacularly. Maya nodded and disappeared into the tree line with a fluidity that left observers blinking in surprise. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, as if the forest had simply absorbed her without effort. The evaluators exchanged glances and began tracking her movement through the compound sensor network. But what they saw defied everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who'd been dismissed as an unqualified pretender. Maya nodded and disappeared into the tree line with a fluidity that left observers blinking in surprise. One moment she was there, the next she was gone, as if the forest had simply absorbed her without effort. The evaluators exchanged glances and began tracking her movement through the compound sensor network. But what they saw defied everything they thought they knew about the quiet woman who'd been dismissed as an unqualified pretender. Maya was about to demonstrate why presidential service credentials existed, and why the tattoo hidden beneath her uniform represented a level of capability that went far beyond anything taught in conventional military training programs. preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What happened next would be analyzed by military instructors for years to come. Maya didn't just complete the impossible mission Blake had assigned her. She redefined what the evaluators thought was possible within the parameters of the exercise. Her approach to the compound was so sophisticated that the electronic monitoring systems initially lost track of her, mistaking her movement for natural background noise rather than human infiltration. She had studied the compound's defensive layout with the eye of someone who'd spent years analyzing real enemy installations where a single mistake meant death rather than training failure. The route she chose avoided the obvious approach paths while exploiting weaknesses in sensor coverage that even the exercise designers hadn't fully considered. When she reached the perimeter, she didn't crash through defenses, she flowed around them like water finding the path of least resistance. The first indication that something extraordinary was happening came when the compound's guards began reporting equipment malfunctions. Sensors were going offline in sequence, communication systems were experiencing mysterious interference, and patrol routes were being disrupted by what appeared to be coordinated equipment failures. The exercise controllers initially assumed they were dealing with technical problems rather than recognizing they were witnessing a masterclass in electronic warfare and psychological operations. Maya had learned these techniques in environments where the enemy used the same equipment. The exercise was simulating, but with lethal rather than training ammunition. She knew exactly how to exploit the weaknesses in standard military communication systems, how to create cascading failures that would mask her actual movements, and how to manipulate human psychology to make guards look away at precisely the right moments. Blake and her team, monitoring from their overwatch position, watched in growing disbelief as Maya systematically dismantled the compound's defenses. Every assumption they'd made about her capabilities was being proven wrong in real time. This wasn't the performance of someone who'd learned military tactics from textbooks. This was operational art practiced by someone who'd used these skills in situations where failure meant capture, torture, or death. How is she doing that? Lewis whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and terror. Through their observation scopes, they could see Maya moving through the compound with the kind of precision that came from years of specialized training and real-world application. Mason was frantically trying to track Maya's movement through his scope, but she kept disappearing into shadows and blind spots that shouldn't have existed. "She's ghost walking," he muttered. "That's not something they teach in regular training. That's special operations stuff, Black Ops level." Blake said nothing, but her face had gone pale with the realization that she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Maya wasn't just competent, she was operating at a level that suggested training and experience that went far beyond anything available through conventional military channels. The quiet woman Blake had dismissed as a fraud was demonstrating capabilities that belonged in classified operation reports rather than training exercises. The climax came when Maya reached the building where the simulated hostage was being held. Instead of attempting a direct assault on the heavily defended structure, she implemented a deception operation that convinced the guards that the real attack was coming from a completely different direction. While they repositioned to meet the phantom threat, Maya extracted the hostage through a route that had been considered impossible by the exercise planners. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, monitoring the exercise from the command post, found himself reaching for his radio to verify that what he was seeing was actually happening. Maya had completed in 18 minutes what the exercise designers had estimated would take a full team at least an hour to accomplish, and she'd done it while operating alone under conditions that should have guaranteed failure. "Sir," one of the monitoring technicians said, his voice filled with confusion, "the candidate designated Maya Sinclair has successfully completed all mission objectives. Hostage recovered, intelligence gathered, 0 casualties sustained. Time to completion, 18 minutes, 43 seconds. Cross stared at the tactical display showing Maya's route through the compound. The path she'd taken was so sophisticated that it looked like it had been planned by someone with intimate knowledge of the facility's design and defensive protocols. But that was impossible. No candidate had access to that level of detail about the exercise setup. "Run it again," Cross ordered. "Check all the sensors, verify the timeline, confirm that she actually accomplished everything the monitors are showing." While the technicians verified Maya's impossible performance, she was making her way back to the rally point where Blake's team was supposed to be providing overwatch support. But when she arrived, she found them in heated argument with each other, their unity fractured by the reality of what they'd just witnessed. "That's not possible," Blake was saying, her voice sharp with denial. "Nobody completes that mission solo. Nobody has those kinds of skills without it being documented somewhere." "Maybe it is documented," Mason replied quietly. "Maybe it's documented in files we don't have clearance to see." The suggestion hung in the air like a physical presence. If Maya's capabilities were classified at levels above their security clearance, it would explain everything: the redacted personnel file, the mysterious assignment to their program, the professional competence that seemed to come from nowhere. It would also mean that their campaign of harassment had been directed at someone whose actual authority and credentials went far beyond anything they'd imagined. Maya emerged from the tree line with the kind of silence that made everyone jump. Despite expecting her return, she wasn't breathing hard, despite having just completed what should have been an exhausting solo mission. Her equipment was properly secured, her uniform was still regulation correct, and her expression was as calm and professional as if she'd just returned from a routine training walk. "Mission complete," she reported to Blake with military formality. "Hostage recovered, intelligence gathered, extraction accomplished without compromise. Are there any additional tasking requirements?" Blake stared at Maya as if seeing her for the first time. The woman standing in front of her wasn't the uncertain civilian candidate she'd been harassing for 3 weeks. This was someone who'd just demonstrated capabilities that belonged in special operations units. Someone who operated with the kind of calm confidence that came from surviving real combat operations. "Who are you?" Blake asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Maya could respond, Lieutenant Cross's voice crackled over their team radio. "All teams return to base immediately for debriefing. Team Alpha, remain in position until instructed otherwise." The radio call carried an urgency that suggested Maya's performance had triggered protocols none of them understood. Within minutes, vehicles were approaching their position, carrying instructors and officials whose presence indicated that the routine training exercise had become something much more serious. Maya watched the approaching convoy with the same calm professionalism she'd shown throughout the exercise, but internally she was calculating probabilities and preparing for multiple contingencies. Her cover had been blown not by enemy action, but by her own competence, and now she would have to deal with the consequences of being revealed as something other than what she'd claimed to be. The time for pretending to be an ordinary candidate was over. Whatever happened next would depend on decisions being made by people whose authority went far beyond a training facility in Virginia. Maya had accomplished her mission of evaluating the program's effectiveness, but she'd also exposed capabilities that were supposed to remain classified at the highest levels of national security. As the convoy reached their position, and senior officers began emerging from official vehicles, Maya knew that the next few minutes would determine whether her revelation led to improved training protocols or to a security investigation that could affect operations spanning multiple continents. The presidential tattoo hidden beneath her uniform was about to become visible to people who would understand exactly what it meant and why its bearer had been operating undercover in their facility. Master Chief Petty Officer Alexander Kane stepped out of the lead vehicle with the kind of measured authority that came from 30 years of special operations experience. At 52, Kane had seen everything the military had to offer, from routine training exercises to classified missions that would never appear in any official record. His weathered face carried scars from operations in 3 different theaters, and his eyes held the kind of steady intelligence that came from making life-and-death decisions under impossible pressure. Kane had been monitoring Maya's exercise performance from the command center, watching through electronic surveillance as she systematically dismantled defenses that had been designed by some of the military's best tactical minds. What he'd witnessed wasn't just exceptional performance. It was operational art practiced at a level that suggested training and experience available to only a handful of people in the entire world. Behind Kane, Captain Robert Pierce emerged from the second vehicle, his expression grim with the kind of seriousness that preceded career-ending conversations. Pierce was the commanding officer of the entire training facility, a man whose decisions affected the careers of hundreds of elite operators. And he looked like someone who just realized that a routine training exercise had become a national security matter. Blake and her team stood at attention as the senior officers approached, but their military bearing couldn't hide the confusion and fear that was radiating from them like heat from a furnace. They'd spent 3 weeks harassing someone they'd assumed was unqualified, and now they were facing the possibility that their target had been operating under authority that went far above their pay grade. "Stand at ease," Kane commanded, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made everyone immediately comply. His eyes swept the group, taking in their obvious nervousness, before settling on Maya with an expression that was difficult to read. Maya remained at attention. Despite the command to relax, her posture perfect, her expression neutral. But there was something in her eyes now, a recognition, perhaps, or an acknowledgement that the game was finally over and real communication could begin. "Candidate Sinclair," Kane said, his voice carefully controlled. "Your performance during today's exercise has raised some questions that require immediate clarification." "Yes, sir," Maya replied, her voice steady and professional. Kane pulled out a tablet and consulted information that was clearly classified above the security clearance of everyone else present. "According to our records, you're here as a civilian candidate with limited military background. But what we just observed suggests capabilities that are inconsistent with that assessment." Blake couldn't contain herself any longer. "Sir, she's been acting suspicious since day one. The way she takes notes, the equipment she carries, the technique she uses, none of it matches her official story." Kane's gaze shifted to Blake with the kind of cold assessment that made seasoned operators uncomfortable. "Sergeant Blake, your concerns have been noted. However, you're not qualified to make judgments about operational capabilities or security classifications." The rebuke was delivered with surgical precision, making it clear that Blake had overstepped her authority in ways that could have serious consequences. But Kane wasn't finished. "In fact," he continued, "your behavior toward candidate Sinclair has been documented and will be subject to review by appropriate authorities. Harassment of personnel operating under classified authority is a serious matter." The words hit Blake like a physical blow. If Maya was operating under classified authority, then everything Blake had done, the harassment, the sabotage, the public humiliation, constituted interference with a classified operation. The kind of interference that ended careers and sometimes led to criminal charges. Kane turned back to Maya, his expression softening slightly. "I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I need a direct answer. Are you operating under presidential directive?" The question hung in the air like an explosive device waiting for detonation. Presidential directives were among the most classified authorities in the entire government, reserved for operations that affected national security at the highest levels. The fact that Kane was even asking the question suggested that Maya's true identity was far more significant than anyone had imagined. Maya met Kane's eyes with steady confidence. "Sir, I am not authorized to discuss the details of my assignment without proper authentication protocols." It was neither confirmation nor denial, but it was the kind of response that someone operating under presidential authority would give when questioned by unauthorized personnel. Kane nodded slowly, as if he'd received exactly the answer he'd expected. "Very well," Kane said. He turned to Captain Pierce and spoke quietly, using terms that the candidates couldn't hear, but that clearly carried significant weight. Pierce's expression grew increasingly serious as the conversation continued, and when it ended, he was looking at Maya with the kind of respect reserved for very senior officials. Kane walked back to his vehicle and returned with a secure communication device. After a brief conversation using codes that confirmed he was speaking to very high-level authority, he approached Maya again. "I've been authorized to request verification of your credentials," he said formally. "If you are operating under presidential directive, you'll need to provide proof of your authority." Maya nodded calmly and began removing her tactical vest and outer uniform shirt. The action sent a ripple of surprise through the assembled candidates. It seemed like an inappropriate response to a request for identification. But as Maya turned to expose her back, the reason for her actions became immediately clear. Running down the length of her spine was an intricate tattoo that made Kane's breath catch in his throat. The Presidential Service Badge, rendered in elaborate detail, with the distinctive eagle and shield design that was reserved for personnel who had served in direct support of presidential operations. But this wasn't just any presidential service tattoo. The additional elements surrounding the central design indicated service in classified operations that required special authorization from the Oval Office itself. Kane had seen presidential service tattoos before, but never one that included the specific symbols and design elements that marked Maya's back. The classification level indicated by those symbols was so high that Kane himself didn't have clearance to access the files that would explain what operations they represented. "Sweet Mother of God," Kane whispered, his professional composure cracking for the first time in decades. Blake, Mason, and Lewis stared at the tattoo with growing horror as they began to understand the magnitude of their error. They hadn't been harassing an unqualified civilian, they'd been interfering with someone whose authority came directly from the highest levels of government. Captain Pierce stepped closer to examine the tattoo, his face pale with the realization that his facility had been hosting a presidential operative without his knowledge. The security implications alone were staggering, but the potential consequences for the personnel who'd been harassing her were even worse. "Ma'am," Pierce said, his voice carrying formal respect that was a stark contrast to the casual dismissal she'd faced for 3 weeks. "I need to apologize for any inappropriate treatment you may have received while operating at this facility." Maya pulled her shirt back on with the same calm efficiency she brought to everything else. "No apology necessary, Captain." The exercise provided valuable data about training protocols and personnel evaluation procedures. The simple statement revealed the true purpose of Maya's presence at the facility. She hadn't been there to complete training, she'd been there to evaluate it, to assess the effectiveness of current protocols and identify areas for improvement. The harassment she'd endured, the challenges she'd faced, the hostility she'd overcome, all of it had been data points in an assessment that would influence how the military trained its most elite operators. Kane was already reaching for his radio, initiating communications that would set in motion a chain of events reaching to the highest levels of military command. Maya's cover had been blown, her mission parameters had changed, and the quiet evaluation that was supposed to remain invisible had become a very public revelation of capabilities that most people weren't cleared to know existed. The candidates who had dismissed her as weak, who had questioned her right to wear the uniform, who had tried to force her out of the program, were about to learn that they had been tested by someone whose authority to evaluate their fitness for service came directly from the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. The silence that followed Maya's revelation stretched across the Virginia training ground like a physical presence. Blake, Mason, and Lewis stood frozen in formation, their minds struggling to process the magnitude of their error. They had spent 3 weeks systematically harassing someone whose authority came directly from the Oval Office, someone whose evaluation of their conduct would be read by officials, whose names appeared on classified documents that shaped national security policy. Master Chief Kane was the first to break the silence, his voice carrying the weight of immediate command authority. "Sergeant Blake, Corporal Mason, Private Lewis, you are hereby relieved of all training responsibilities pending a comprehensive review of your conduct during this exercise period." The words fell like hammer blows, each one representing the end of military careers that had taken years to build. Relief from training responsibilities was military code for career termination, especially when it involved interference with classified operations. Blake's face had gone ashen, but her pride wouldn't allow her to accept the situation quietly. "Sir, with all due respect, we had no way of knowing. You had no way of knowing because you made assumptions based on appearances rather than conducting proper assessment." Kane interrupted, his tone cutting through Blake's attempted defense. "Military effectiveness depends on recognizing competence regardless of how it's packaged. Your failure to do so represents a fundamental deficiency in judgment that disqualifies you from Special Operations service." Captain Pierce stepped forward, with a tablet in his hand, already pulling up documentation that would formalize the consequences. "Sergeant Blake, your conduct toward Operative Sinclair has been recorded by multiple surveillance systems. Deliberate equipment sabotage, coordinated harassment, and attempted mission compromise constitute violations of multiple sections of the Uniform Code of Military Justice." The charges were serious enough to end more than just Blake's military career. They carried potential civilian criminal penalties for interfering with classified government operations. Blake opened her mouth to protest, then closed it as she realized that anything she said would only make her situation worse. Mason, meanwhile, was calculating the full scope of his exposure. His role in sabotaging Maya's equipment during field exercises had been captured on training facility security cameras. What he'd thought was justifiable pressure tactics to expose an unqualified candidate was now documented, evidence of criminal interference with a presidential directive operation. "Corporal Mason," Pierce continued, consulting his tablet, "your deliberate sabotage of navigation equipment and communication systems during field exercises represents destruction of government property and interference with classified operations. You're facing both military tribunal and potential federal criminal charges." Lewis, the youngest of the three, finally grasped the reality of their situation and broke down completely. "We didn't know," she said, her voice cracking with panic. "She never said anything about being undercover. How were we supposed to know?" Maya spoke for the first time since revealing her tattoo, her voice carrying the calm authority that came from years of operating in situations where mistakes had life and death consequences. "The assumption that competence must announce itself is precisely the kind of thinking that gets operatives killed in the field. Your inability to recognize capability when it doesn't match your preconceptions represents a fundamental security vulnerability." Her words carried weight beyond simple criticism. They were professional assessments that would be included in reports that influenced how the military selected and trained special operations personnel. Maya hadn't just been enduring harassment, she'd been documenting systematic failures in personnel evaluation that had national security implications. Kane was already coordinating with higher authority through his secure communication device, using codes that indicated direct communication with Pentagon-level command. The conversation was brief but clearly decisive, and when it ended, Kane's expression was grim with the certainty of consequences that couldn't be appealed or modified. "Effective immediately," Kane announced. "All 3 candidates are terminated from this program and will be transferred to administrative hold pending final disposition of charges. Their security clearances are suspended, and they are prohibited from discussing any aspect of this incident with unauthorized personnel." The administrative language couldn't disguise the severity of what was happening. Blake, Mason, and Lewis were being removed not just from the training program, but from any position where they could pose a security risk. Their military careers were over, and their future prospects in any field requiring security clearance had been eliminated. But the consequences extended beyond the 3 primary antagonists. Kane turned to address the other candidates who had witnessed the confrontation, his voice carrying warning that was unmistakable in its implications. "Let me be clear about something," he said, his eyes sweeping across the assembled trainees. "Operative Sinclair has been conducting a classified assessment of this facility's training protocols and personnel evaluation procedures. Every interaction, every comment, every demonstration of judgment or lack thereof has been documented and will be included in her final report." The revelation sent a chill through the candidates who had remained silent during Maya's harassment. They suddenly realized that their failure to intervene, their willingness to go along with obviously inappropriate behavior, their complicity in systematic harassment, all of it had been observed and recorded by someone whose evaluation would determine their future in special operations. Several candidates who had participated in the casual mockery of Maya during the first weeks began to understand that their careers might also be in jeopardy. The military's zero-tolerance policy for harassment was well known, but harassment of a presidential operative carried implications that went far beyond normal disciplinary action. Maya pulled out her notebook, the same notebook that had been the subject of so much speculation and suspicion, and began writing with the methodical precision that had frustrated her tormentors for 3 weeks. But now, watching her document the morning's events, everyone understood what they were really seeing. This wasn't a training diary or personal observations. This was an official after-action report that would be read by officials whose decisions shaped military policy at the highest levels. "Ma'am," one of the candidates who had remained neutral during the harassment asked hesitantly, "will your report include recommendations about personnel who didn't participate in the inappropriate behavior?" Maya looked up from her notebook with an expression that was professional but not unkind. "My report will include assessment of all personnel observed during this evaluation period, with particular attention to judgment, professionalism, and adherence to military values under stress." It was a diplomatic way of saying that everyone's behavior had been noted and would be evaluated according to standards that went beyond simple task completion. Leadership under pressure, moral courage in the face of inappropriate behavior, professional ethics when authority figures weren't watching, all of it had been part of the test. And most of them had failed without realizing they were being evaluated. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, who had been observing the confrontation with growing unease, finally understood the full scope of what had been happening under his command. For 3 weeks, he had been witnessing systematic harassment of a presidential operative while doing nothing to intervene. His failure to recognize and stop the inappropriate behavior represented a massive leadership failure that would be documented in reports that reached the highest levels of military command. As military police vehicles arrived to escort Blake, Mason, and Lewis from the facility, Maya continued writing in her notebook with the same calm efficiency she'd shown throughout her entire assignment. The quiet woman who had been dismissed as weak had systematically documented failures in personnel evaluation, leadership development, and military culture that would influence special operations training for years to come. The exercise was over, but the real consequences were just beginning. Maya's report would trigger changes in how the military identified and developed elite operators, how it assessed character under pressure, and how it ensured that personal prejudices didn't compromise mission effectiveness. The harassment she'd endured had become data that would protect future operatives from similar treatment, while improving the quality of personnel selected for the most demanding military assignments. Within 48 hours of Maya's revelation, the Naval Special Warfare Training Center at Little Creek underwent the most comprehensive policy overhaul in its 30-year history. The changes began at the highest levels of command and cascaded down through every aspect of training protocols, personnel evaluation, and facility culture, with the kind of systematic efficiency that only came from direct presidential directive. Captain Robert Pierce found himself in the uncomfortable position of explaining to admirals and generals how a presidential operative had been systematically harassed under his command for 3 weeks without any intervention from facility leadership. The secure video conference that determined his fate included faces from the Pentagon, the White House, and agencies whose names didn't appear on any public organizational charts. Captain Pierce, the voice from Washington was cold with barely controlled anger. How exactly did your facility fail to recognize a presidential operative for 21 days? Pierce had been dreading this question since Maya's identity was revealed. Sir, the operative's cover identity was comprehensive and professionally maintained. Her documentation appeared consistent with civilian candidate protocols. That's not what I'm asking, Captain. The voice belonged to a general whose decisions shaped special operations policy across all branches of the military. I'm asking how your training environment became so toxic that a decorated operative was subjected to harassment that would have been unacceptable under any circumstances. The question cut to the heart of the institutional failures that Maya's assignment had been designed to identify. Her harassment hadn't been the result of her cover identity. It had been the result of a training culture that tolerated bullying, encouraged prejudice, and rewarded aggression over competence. Pierce's career ended with a brief formal statement that cited his failure to maintain appropriate training environment standards. But his removal was just the beginning of changes that would transform how the military's most elite units identified and developed personnel. Maya's first official act in her new role as Director of Advanced Training Assessment was to implement a comprehensive review of candidate evaluation protocols. The conference room where she'd been briefed on her new responsibilities was filled with officials whose authority spanned multiple agencies and government departments. The current system, Maya said, consulting the detailed analysis she'd compiled during her undercover assignment, prioritizes obvious demonstrations of competence over actual capability assessment. This creates systematic bias against operatives whose strengths don't conform to traditional expectations. She activated a presentation that displayed statistical analysis of candidate performance correlated with harassment incidents. The data was stark and undeniable. Some of the most effective operatives were also the most likely to face inappropriate treatment from peers and instructors who couldn't recognize competence that didn't announce itself aggressively. Recommendation 1, Maya continued. Implement blind evaluation protocols where candidate assessment is separated from demographic information and social dynamics. Competence should be measured by results, not by conformity to expected behavior. Patterns. The recommendation carried weight because it came from someone who had personally experienced the consequences of evaluation bias. Maya's assignment had provided data that couldn't be disputed or rationalized away evidence that institutional prejudices were compromising the military's ability to identify and develop its most valuable personnel. Within a week, training facilities across all branches of the military began implementing Maya's assessment protocols. The changes were comprehensive and immediate, affecting everything from initial candidate screening to final graduation. Requirements. The most significant innovation was the introduction of mystery operative exercises, where candidates were evaluated on their ability to recognize competence, regardless of how it was packaged. Teams would include undercover instructors whose job was to assess how well candidates could identify and work with capable personnel who didn't fit conventional expectations. Lieutenant Nathan Cross, whose leadership failures during Maya's harassment had been thoroughly documented, found himself reassigned to a position where his decisions couldn't affect personnel development. His replacement was specifically chosen for demonstrated ability to recognize and develop unconventional talent. The new training protocols also addressed the systematic bullying that had characterized facility culture for years. Maya's documentation of harassment patterns had revealed that inappropriate behavior was often rationalized as building character or testing resolve, when it was actually just institutionalized cruelty that drove away exactly the kind of innovative thinkers the military needed most. Zero tolerance means zero tolerance, the new facility commander announced during his first all-hands meeting. Harassment will result in immediate termination, regardless of the perpetrator's rank, performance record, or connections. This facility exists to develop elite operators, not to provide an outlet for personal insecurities. But the most profound changes were in how competence itself was defined and measured. Maya's performance during her undercover assignment had demonstrated that the most valuable operators weren't necessarily the most obvious ones. Her ability to observe, analyze, and adapt had proven more valuable than any amount of aggressive self-promotion or conventional military-bearing training scenarios were redesigned to reward problem-solving over power projection, collaboration over domination, and analytical thinking over reflexive aggression. The changes didn't eliminate physical standards or reduce the demanding nature of special operations training, but they expanded the definition of what made an effective operator. Psychological evaluation protocols were completely overhauled. Based on Maya's analysis of personality, types that succeeded in real operations versus those that succeeded in training environments. Her research had identified critical gaps between the qualities that impressed instructors and the qualities that actually contributed to mission success in classified operations. The most dangerous operatives, Maya explained to a gathering of training command officials, are often the ones who blend into any environment, who can assess situations without revealing their capabilities, who can influence outcomes without drawing attention to themselves. These are precisely the qualities that traditional evaluation methods fail to identify. Her words carried special weight because everyone in the room had witnessed exactly that phenomenon. Maya had operated under their observation for 3 weeks, demonstrating extraordinary capabilities that none of them had recognized until she chose to reveal them. The changes extended beyond training protocols to fundamental shifts in military culture. Facilities began implementing mentorship programs designed to identify and develop personnel whose strengths might not be immediately obvious. Leadership development courses were expanded to include training on recognizing diverse forms of competence and creating inclusive environments where all types of talent could flourish. Maya's influence reached far beyond the facility where she'd conducted her undercover assessment. Her recommendations were being implemented in special operations training programs across all branches of the military, affecting how thousands of personnel would be evaluated and developed over the coming years. The quiet woman, who had been dismissed as weak and unqualified, had become the architect of a new approach to identifying and developing military excellence. Her harassment had been transformed into data that would protect future generations of operatives, while ensuring that the military's most demanding assignments were filled by the most capable personnel, regardless of whether their competence announced itself in traditional ways. But perhaps the most significant change was in the understanding of what strength really meant in special operations. Maya had proven that true power often remained hidden until the moment it was needed most, that the most effective operators were those who could influence outcomes without revealing their capabilities, and that the military's most valuable assets were often its most underestimated personnel. The transformation was comprehensive, systematic, and permanent. The harassment Maya had endured for 3 weeks would prevent similar treatment for countless others while ensuring that the military's most elite units were filled with personnel whose competence had been properly recognized and developed. Her sacrifice had become the foundation for a better way of identifying and training the operators who would protect national security in an increasingly complex world. 2 years after Maya Sinclair's revelation at the Naval Special Warfare Training Center, the ripple effects of her undercover assessment had transformed special operations training across the entire United States military establishment. The changes she'd initiated extended far beyond simple policy modifications. They represented a fundamental shift in how the world's most powerful military identified, developed, and deployed its most valuable human assets. The statistical evidence of transformation was undeniable. Graduation rates from special operations programs had increased by 38%, but more importantly, the quality of graduates had improved dramatically. Mission success rates for units trained under Maya's revised protocols showed a 23% improvement over previous standards, with significantly reduced casualty rates in high-risk operations. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real transformation was cultural, affecting how military personnel at every level understood the relationship between competence and appearance, between strength and visibility, between leadership and self-promotion. Maya's experience had become a case study taught in military academies, staff colleges, and leadership development programs throughout the armed forces. General Patricia Hammond, the 4-star general who had overseen the implementation of Maya's recommendations, stood before a gathering of international military leaders at the Pentagon, explaining how the American approach to special operations training had evolved. The Sinclair Protocol, as Maya's assessment framework had become known, was being studied and adapted by allied military forces around the world. Traditional evaluation methods, Hammond explained to the assembled officials, were designed for conventional warfare paradigms where obvious displays of competence correlated with battlefield effectiveness. Modern special operations require personnel who can blend into any environment, who can influence outcomes without revealing their capabilities, who can succeed through intelligence rather than intimidation. The audience included military leaders from 23 countries, all seeking to understand how the American military had achieved such dramatic improvements in special operations effectiveness. Maya's insights were being requested by NATO allies, Pacific Partnership nations, and friendly governments whose security depended on the quality of their elite military units. Maya herself had been promoted to the newly created position of Director of Global Training Assessment, with authority that spanned all branches of the American military and extended to advisory roles with allied forces. Her office in the Pentagon was modest and functional, decorated with commendations from operations that remained classified and photographs of training facilities she'd helped redesign around the world. The most significant long-term impact was in personnel retention and development. Before Maya's reforms, approximately 40% of special operations personnel left military service within 5 years of completing training, often citing toxic work environments and failure of leadership to recognize their contributions. Under the new protocols, retention rates had improved to over 70%, with personnel reporting dramatically higher satisfaction with their career development opportunities. Dr. Amanda Foster, the military psychologist who had worked with Maya to develop new assessment frameworks, published research that demonstrated the correlation between inclusive training environments and operational effectiveness. When personnel feel valued for their actual contributions, rather than their ability to conform to stereotypical expectations, Foster wrote, their performance improves across all measurable metrics. The research had implications beyond military applications. Corporate leadership programs, law enforcement training academies, and emergency response organizations were adapting Maya's insights to improve their own personnel development strategies. The principles she'd identified, that competence often remained hidden until properly recognized, that diverse approaches to problem-solving improved outcomes, that harassment was always counterproductive regardless of its justification, were proving valuable across multiple sectors. International, military exchanges had become opportunities to share Maya's methodologies with allied forces. British Special Air Service training incorporated Maya's mystery operative exercises. Israeli Defense Forces adapted her bias recognition protocols. Australian Special Forces implemented her collaborative leadership development programs. The approaches that had emerged from Maya's harassment were becoming standard practice for elite military units worldwide. Perhaps most importantly, the military had developed institutional memory about the costs of prejudice and the value of recognizing hidden talent. Maya's experience was taught as required curriculum in officer training programs, ensuring that future military leaders understood how assumptions about competence could compromise mission effectiveness and personnel development. The case studies were powerful and specific. Maya's documentation had provided concrete examples of how harassment affected performance, how bias influenced evaluation, and how institutional culture could either support or undermine the development of critical capabilities. Military academies used her data to teach courses on leadership, ethics, and organizational effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, no relation to Maya, despite the shared first name, had been one of the first officers trained under the new protocols. 5 years later, she commanded a special operations unit that had achieved unprecedented success in classified missions across 3 different theaters of operation. The Sinclair method taught us to look beyond obvious indicators of capability. Chun explained to a group of junior officers during a leadership development seminar. Some of our most effective operators are people who would have been overlooked or harassed under the old system. We've learned to identify and develop talent regardless of how it's packaged. The transformation had also affected how the military recruited new personnel. Recruiting protocols had been modified to identify candidates whose potential might not be immediately obvious, whose backgrounds might not fit traditional patterns, whose strengths might emerge only under specific conditions. The pool of potential special operations personnel had expanded significantly, improving both quality and diversity. Maya's influence extended to international counterterrorism cooperation, where her insights about recognizing hidden capabilities had proven crucial for identifying and neutralizing threats that operated through deception and misdirection. Intelligence agencies had adapted her analytical frameworks to improve their assessment of both friendly and hostile operatives, whose true capabilities remained concealed. The technology sector had also taken notice of Maya's work, particularly her research on how organizational bias affected innovation and problem-solving. Silicon Valley companies began implementing modified versions of her assessment protocols to identify and develop technical talent that might not conform to traditional expectations, but the most meaningful impact was personal and immediate. The thousands of military personnel who were now serving effectively in positions they might never have achieved under the old system. Maya received letters from operatives around the world, thanking her for creating environments where their contributions were recognized and valued. Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, who had been dismissed from special operations training twice under the old protocols, had become one of the military's most decorated intelligence specialists after being re-evaluated under Maya's frameworks. The new system saw what the old system missed, Rodriguez wrote in a letter that Maya kept in her desk drawer. I'm finally able to serve my country using the capabilities I've always had. The transformation was ongoing and accelerating. Each year brought new refinements to Maya's original insights, new applications of her principles, and new evidence that recognizing hidden competence was essential for organizational effectiveness in an increasingly complex world. her 3 weeks of harassment had become the foundation for decades of improved military performance and personnel development. 5 years after the morning when Staff Sergeant Victoria Blake had demanded that Maya Sinclair strip in front of 200 elite trainees, Maya stood in her Pentagon office, reviewing classified reports that detailed the global impact of her undercover assessment. The walls around her displayed commendations from operations that would never be publicly acknowledged, photographs from training facilities on 6 continents, and letters from personnel whose careers had been shaped by the changes she'd initiated. Presidential tattoo that had frozen Master Chief Kane in recognition remained hidden beneath her dress uniform, but its significance had evolved far beyond its original meaning. What had once been a mark of individual service had become a symbol of institutional transformation, representing the military's commitment to recognizing competence, regardless of how it was packaged or presented. Maya's morning briefing included updates from special operations units around the world, all reporting improved performance metrics under training protocols that emphasize substance over appearance, results over rhetoric, competence over conformity. The data was consistently positive, but Maya knew that the real measure of success wasn't statistical. It was the individual stories of personnel who were now serving effectively in positions they might never have achieved under the old system. Her secure telephone rang with a distinctive tone that indicated a call from the highest levels of government. The voice on the other end belonged to the current President of the United States, the third Commander-in-Chief to personally consult with Maya about military personnel development during her tenure as Director of Global Training Assessment. "Maya," the President said, using the informal address that had become standard for their consultations, "I wanted to personally thank you for the latest assessment of our Pacific operations capabilities. Your recommendations are being implemented immediately." The conversation lasted 15 minutes and covered topics that would influence military policy for years to come. Maya's insights, born from her experience of being systematically underestimated and harassed, had become essential input for decisions that affected national security at the strategic level. After ending the call, Maya returned to the document. She'd been reviewing a comprehensive analysis of how the Sinclair Protocol had influenced military effectiveness over the past 5 years. The improvements were measurable and significant, but they also represented something more profound than enhanced operational capability. The military had learned to see strength where it had previously seen weakness, to recognize leadership where it had previously seen submission, to value analytical thinking where it had previously rewarded aggressive self-promotion. The changes weren't just procedural, they were philosophical, affecting how the world's most powerful military understood the relationship between competence and appearance. Maya's influence extended far beyond the American military establishment. International military academies taught courses based on her research. Allied special operations units had implemented modified versions of her assessment frameworks. Intelligence agencies around the world used her insights to better identify and develop personnel whose capabilities might not be immediately obvious, but perhaps the most meaningful aspect of Maya's legacy was its impact on individual lives. Her office files contained thousands of letters from military personnel who credited the new training protocols with recognizing and developing their potential. Many of them were people who had been overlooked, dismissed, or harassed under the old system, but had become highly effective operators once their true capabilities were properly identified. Major Jennifer Kim, who had been rejected from special operations training 3 times under the previous protocols, had become one of the military's most successful counterintelligence specialists after being re-evaluated under Maya's frameworks. Her recent commendation for preventing a major security breach included a personal note: "Thank you for creating a system that saw what others missed." Captain David Thompson, whose quiet analytical approach had been dismissed as weakness under the old evaluation methods, had led a team that successfully completed one of the most complex hostage rescue operations in recent history. His after-action report specifically credited training protocols that emphasized collaborative problem-solving over individual aggression. These success stories were replicated thousands of times across all branches of the military, representing personnel who were now serving effectively because Maya's experience had taught the institution to look beyond surface appearances to identify true competence. The transformation had also influenced how the military addressed harassment and toxic leadership. Maya's documentation of systematic bullying had provided undeniable evidence that such behavior was not only morally wrong, but operationally counterproductive. Zero-tolerance policies were now enforced with the kind of systematic rigor that had previously been reserved for security violations. Lieutenant Colonel Rachel Stevens, who had been assigned to investigate and prevent harassment in special operations units, published an annual report that showed dramatic improvements in workplace culture and personnel retention. The Sinclair incident, as Maya's experience had become known in military circles, served as a constant reminder that toxic behavior would not be tolerated regardless of its justification or the perpetrator's rank. Maya's work had also influenced civilian organizations seeking to improve their own personnel development strategies. Corporations, law enforcement agencies, emergency response organizations, and educational institutions had adapted her insights to create more inclusive and effective evaluation systems. The Harvard Business School had developed a case study based on Maya's experience, teaching future business leaders about the costs of organizational bias and the benefits of recognizing diverse forms of competence. The case was required reading in leadership development programs at universities around the world. As Maya prepared to leave her office that evening, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from the harassment she'd endured at Little Creek to her current position as one of the military's most influential policy developers. The transformation hadn't been easy or immediate, but it had been comprehensive and permanent. The quiet woman who had been stripped of her uniform in front of hundreds of observers had become the architect of a new understanding of military excellence. Her presidential tattoo remained hidden beneath her uniform, but its meaning had spread throughout the military establishment and beyond, representing the principle that true strength often remained concealed until the moment it was needed most. Maya's legacy would continue long after her own service ended. The principles she'd identified, the protocols she'd developed, and the cultural changes she'd initiated would influence military personnel development for generations to come. Her 3 weeks of systematic harassment had been transformed into decades of improved opportunities for personnel whose competence might not announce itself in traditional ways. The harassment had ended, but the healing it had produced continued to spread throughout the military establishment and beyond, ensuring that future generations of service members would be evaluated based on their actual capabilities rather than their conformity to outdated expectations. Maya Sinclair had proven that the most dangerous operatives were often the ones nobody saw coming, and the military was stronger for having learned that lesson. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.